He kept 2 granddaughters as wives for decades, the most inbred grandfather of the Ozark Hills, a man whose dark legacy still haunts the remote valleys of Missouri to this day. This is the disturbing true story of Jeremiah Blackwood, born in 1898, whose isolated family compound became the center of one of America's most shocking cases of familial intermarriage ever documented. The year was 1967, when authorities first discovered the Blackwood family living in complete isolation on a 200-acre property deep in the Ozark Mountains. What they found would forever change how we understand the consequences of genetic isolation in rural America. Our story begins in the late 1800s, when the Blackwood family first settled in the remote hills of southern Missouri. The patriarch, Isaiah Blackwood, brought his family to this isolated region specifically to escape what he called the corruption of modern society. Little did the outside world know that this search for isolation would lead to generations of intermarriage that created a family tree that curled inward upon itself like a gnarled root. The dense forests and deep valleys of the Ozarks provided the perfect hiding place. The rugged terrain made travel difficult, and neighbors were often miles apart. In these conditions, the Blackwoods thrived in their isolation, building a small compound of cabins connected by dirt paths, cultivating just enough land to sustain themselves, and interacting with outsiders only when absolutely necessary. By the 1940s, Jeremiah Blackwood had become the family patriarch. After his wife passed away from complications during childbirth in 1938, he began to exercise complete control over his growing family. His isolation tactics became more extreme. He removed his children from the local schoolhouse, claiming that education corrupted the mind. He forbade them from attending church gatherings or community events. The family became known locally as those strange Blackwoods up on the ridge, but few suspected the true nature of what was happening behind the walls of their compound. Jeremiah had 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. As they grew into adulthood, the oldest son, Luther, left the compound after a violent disagreement with his father in 1952. The 2 remaining sons, Elijah and Silas, stayed, eventually bringing wives from neighboring communities into the family. His daughters, Ruth and Esther, were never permitted to marry outside the family. Instead, they remained in their father's home, eventually bearing children whose paternity was never discussed among the family. By 1960, the Blackwood compound had grown to include nearly 20 individuals spanning 3 generations. The most disturbing aspect of the family structure began to emerge in the late 1950s, when Jeremiah, then in his early 60s, began to take a special interest in his granddaughters, Mary and Sarah, born to his daughter Ruth. The girls, who grew up believing Jeremiah was their father, were kept isolated even from other members of the extended family. Local storekeeper Thomas Jenkins, who occasionally traded with the Blackwoods, later recounted to investigators, those girls never spoke when they came to town. They would stand behind the old man, eyes down, never uttering a word. I always thought something wasn't right, but folks around here mind their own business. As Mary and Sarah entered their teenage years, they disappeared from the rare public appearances the family made. It wasn't until years later that the truth emerged. Jeremiah had taken both girls as his wives. In a private ceremony he conducted himself, claiming divine authority as the family patriarch. This union produced 7 children between 1962 and 1967, all of whom showed signs of serious genetic disorders. The compound's secrets might have remained hidden for decades more, if not for a chance encounter in the spring of 1967. A forest ranger named Michael Collins, investigating reports of illegal hunting on government land adjacent to the Blackwood property, stumbled upon a young child wandering in the woods. The child, severely malnourished and exhibiting obvious developmental issues, could barely communicate. When Collins attempted to return the child to his family, he discovered the horrifying reality of the Blackwood compound. "I've worked these forests for 20 years, Collins later testified, but nothing prepared me for what I saw that day. It was like stepping back in time to some medieval nightmare." What Collins found was a family in severe decline. Years of intermarriage had resulted in children with profound physical and cognitive impairments. Many had malformed limbs, facial abnormalities, and could not speak intelligibly. The living conditions were primitive, with no running water or electricity, despite the modernization of most of rural Missouri by the 1960s. Most disturbing was the family structure itself. Through careful questioning and observation, Collins realized that Jeremiah, now 69 years old, claimed all of the youngest children as his own children born to women who were both his granddaughters and daughters-in-law, in the most tangled family tree authorities had ever encountered in the region. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. The shocking truth of America's hidden bloodlines has been kept secret for generations. Subscribe now to uncover the dark histories that society tried to bury forever. When authorities arrived at the Blackwood compound in June 1967, they were unprepared for the scale of the tragedy they discovered. Social worker Eleanor Richards was among the first officials to interview the family members. The Blackwood case represented the most extreme isolation I've encountered in my 25 years of service, Richards noted in her official report. These weren't simply poor hill people living off the land. This was a deliberate attempt to create a separate society, with its own rules and structures, all centered around Jeremiah Blackwood's disturbing authority. The investigation revealed a compound of 5 crude cabins arranged in a semicircle around a central building where Jeremiah lived with his 2 granddaughter wives. The other cabins housed his sons and their families, all living under strict rules established by the patriarch. The family survived through subsistence farming, occasional hunting, often illegally on government land, and infrequent trading with the nearest town, some 15 miles away. What made the Blackwood case particularly shocking was not just the presence of intermarriage, which historically had occurred in other isolated communities, but the deliberate and systematic nature of it. Examination of Jeremiah's private journals, confiscated during the investigation, revealed a disturbing philosophy he had developed over decades. "The outside blood weakens us," he wrote in one entry from 1954. "I have seen how the old families who kept to themselves have stronger bonds, deeper understanding. What they call forbiddance, I call purification." The journals documented his growing obsession with bloodlines and genetic purity, though he lacked the scientific understanding to recognize the devastating consequences of his beliefs. Instead, he interpreted the visible disabilities in his grandchildren as signs of spiritual corruption from the outside world, rather than the inevitable result of genetic disorders caused by consanguineous relationships. Dr. William Hayes, a geneticist called in to consult on the case, explained the scientific reality. What we observed in the Blackwood children was a textbook case of genetic collapse due to inbreeding. Multiple recessive genetic disorders had become expressed due to the limited gene pool. Several children exhibited signs of autosomal recessive conditions that would be extremely rare in the general population, but appeared with alarming frequency in this family. The 7 youngest children, the offspring of Jeremiah and his granddaughters, suffered the most severe conditions. All exhibited reduced cognitive function, and 5 had visible physical abnormalities, including cleft palates, malformed limbs, and unusual facial features. 2 were nearly blind from congenital cataracts, and 1 could not walk at all despite being 5 years old. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the psychological state of Mary and Sarah, who had been taken as wives by their grandfather when they were just 14 and 15 years old. Now in their early 20s, they exhibited signs of severe trauma and psychological conditioning. They referred to Jeremiah only as the father and believed his word to be absolute truth. They had been told that the outside world was evil and corrupt, and that their special relationship with Jeremiah was blessed and sacred. They had no concept that their situation was unusual or wrong, explained psychologist Dr. Margaret Wilson, who conducted initial evaluations of the women. Their isolation was so complete that they had no frame of reference for normal family structures or relationships. They had been taught that their purpose was to bear pure children for the continuation of the Blackwood line. The investigation also uncovered evidence of earlier victims. Records indicated that Jeremiah's own daughters, Ruth and Esther, had borne children in the 1940s and early 1950s, whose paternity was deliberately obscured in family records. These children, now adults with children of their own, created a family tree so tangled that geneticists called in to map the bloodlines described. It as a genetic labyrinth, unprecedented in modern American records. Weather-beaten photographs found in Jeremiah's cabin told a visual story of the family's decline. Images from the 1930s showed relatively healthy-looking individuals, while later photographs revealed the progressive emergence of physical abnormalities with each generation. The most recent pictures displayed children with obvious genetic disorders becoming increasingly severe visual evidence of the biological consequences of generations of consanguinity. The compound itself reflected the family's isolation from modern America. While most rural homes in Missouri had electricity by the late 1960s, the Blackwoods lived without power or running water. Their cabins were lit by oil lamps, heated by wood stoves, and furnished with handmade items. They used an outhouse rather than indoor plumbing, drew water from a well, and preserved food using methods unchanged since the 19th century. This physical isolation reinforced their cultural and genetic isolation. Without television, radio, or regular contact with outsiders, the younger Blackwoods had no way to understand that their living situation was abnormal. They spoke with unusual accents and used words and phrases that had disappeared from common usage decades earlier, creating what linguists later described as a time capsule of Ozark dialect from the early 1900s. The family's religious beliefs had evolved into a unique system centered around Jeremiah's authority, though originally based in fundamentalist Christianity. Their isolated practice had morphed into something unrecognizable to mainstream denominations. Jeremiah claimed direct communication with the divine and used this supposed connection to justify his position and actions. He had created a small shrine in his cabin where family members were required to participate in unusual rituals that mixed elements of traditional Ozark folk practices with his own inventions. Local reaction to the discovery was complicated by the region's cultural emphasis on privacy and self-determination. While most expressed horror at the conditions of the children, some locals questioned whether government intervention was appropriate. Folks have always lived how they wanted in these hills, one anonymous neighbor told the Springfield News Leader in July 1967. Not saying what happened there was right, it surely wasn't, but there's a long tradition of keeping to ourselves and handling our own problems. This tension between autonomy and protection would shape the legal proceedings that followed, and reflect the broader challenges of addressing such cases in America's most isolated regions. By autumn of 1967, the Blackwood case had captured the attention of medical professionals across the country. The family represented one of the most extensive and well-documented instances of multi-generational consanguinity in modern American history, providing a tragic but scientifically significant glimpse into the genetic consequences of inbreeding in humans. Dr. Robert Lancaster, a specialist in genetic disorders from Washington University in St. Louis, led a team that conducted comprehensive examinations of all family members. Their findings painted a grim picture of progressive genetic collapse. What makes the Blackwood case so scientifically significant, Dr. Lancaster explained in his published case study, is that we can trace the increasing frequency and severity of genetic disorders through 4 generations. The pattern precisely follows what genetic theory would predict: a dramatic increase in homozygosity for recessive alleles, leading to the expression of numerous genetic disorders. The medical team identified multiple recessive conditions in the youngest generation, including phenylketonuria, Tay-Sachs disease, and several rare metabolic disorders that normally occur in fewer than 1 in 100,000 births in the general population. The concentration of these conditions in a single family provided compelling evidence of the dangers of close genetic relationships. The legal case against Jeremiah Blackwood moved forward simultaneously with the medical investigations. Prosecuting attorney Robert Williams faced significant challenges in building his case, not least because of the complex family relationships that made traditional definitions of incest difficult to apply. The Blackwood family structure has created unprecedented legal questions, Williams stated in court documents. The defendants' relationships to the victims cross multiple familiar categories. Complicating matters further was the question of jurisdiction and temporal authority. Many of the relationships had begun years earlier, some potentially outside the statute of limitations. Additionally, the most isolated portions of the Blackwood property technically straddled the border between 2 counties, raising questions about which court had proper jurisdiction. As the legal machinery slowly advanced, social services faced the immediate challenge of caring for the affected family members, particularly the children. The 7 youngest children were placed in specialized care facilities capable of addressing their significant medical and developmental needs. Mary and Sarah, Jeremiah's granddaughter wives, were initially hospitalized for medical treatment and psychological evaluation before being moved to a residential therapy program, specifically designed for victims of prolonged trauma and psychological manipulation. The older generation of Blackwood's Jeremiah's sons, Elijah and Silas, and their wives, presented a different set of challenges. While they had participated in the isolated community, evidence suggested they had done so under varying degrees of coercion and psychological control from Jeremiah, determining their legal culpability while also addressing their own needs as potential victims created significant ethical dilemmas for both prosecutors and social services. Throughout the autumn of 1967, as these various proceedings moved forward, journalists began to take interest in the case. Initial local reporting in the Springfield News Leader and the Arkansas Democrat gradually gave way to national coverage, with major publications sending reporters to the Ozarks to investigate this shocking story of isolation and genetic tragedy. The media attention brought mixed consequences. While it raised awareness about the dangers of genetic isolation and the need for protective services in remote rural areas, it also sensationalized the Blackwood story. Headlines like "Hillbilly Horror," "The Monster of the Ozarks," "An American Freak Family Discovered in Missouri Woods" reflected the lurid fascination that sometimes overshadowed the human tragedy at the core of the case. For the residents of Shannon County and the surrounding Ozark communities, the Blackwood case forced uncomfortable reflections on local traditions of privacy and non-interference. Many locals expressed shame that such a situation had existed in their community without intervention for so many years. "We've always believed in letting folks live as they choose," said Harold Jenkins, a county commissioner, during a community meeting called to discuss the case. "But there's a difference between respecting privacy and ignoring suffering. As a community, we failed those children by not asking more questions when we sensed something wasn't right." The psychological evaluations of Mary and Sarah revealed the profound impact of their insulation and manipulation. Having been separated from broader society since birth and subjected to Jeremiah's indoctrination, they struggled to understand why they had been removed from the compound, or why their relationship with their grandfather was considered wrong. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the lead psychologist working with the women, described their condition. "They exhibit a form of complex trauma combined with what we might now call cult programming. Their entire reality was constructed by Jeremiah, leaving them without the psychological tools to evaluate their situation objectively. Their recovery will require not just addressing trauma, but literally rebuilding their understanding of family, society, and self-identity from the ground up." If you've been watching this dark chapter of American history unfold, pause right now and type "Blood Speaks Through Generations" in the comments. Your words acknowledge these forgotten victims and ensure their suffering wasn't in vain. Despite the significant challenges they faced, both women showed remarkable resilience as they began the long process of psychological recovery. By December 1967, they had progressed enough to assist prosecutors in building their case against Jeremiah, providing crucial testimony about life inside the compound. The question that haunted investigators, medical professionals, and the public alike was how such a situation could have persisted undetected for so long in modern America. The answer lay in a perfect storm of geographical isolation, cultural factors, and deliberate deception. The trial of Jeremiah Blackwood began on February 12, 1968, in the Shannon County Courthouse. Despite the sensational nature of the case, Judge William Harrison ordered limited media access, citing the dignity and privacy of the victims. This decision created a striking scene outside the courthouse, where dozens of reporters from across the country gathered each day, desperate for any details about the proceedings inside. Prosecuting attorney Robert Williams opened the state's case with a powerful statement. This is not merely about prohibited relationships. This is about the calculated destruction of human potential, about children born into suffering because one man decided his bloodline was more important than their health or future. The prosecution built its case methodically, combining medical evidence with testimony from family members and the few outsiders who had interacted with the Blackwoods over the years. Dr. Lancaster presented detailed genetic evidence showing the progressive deterioration of health across generations, while psychologists testified about the extreme psychological control Jeremiah had exerted over the family. Most compelling was the testimony of Mary and Sarah, who appeared in court on February 20th, speaking softly and often needing breaks to compose themselves. They described their upbringing in the compound and their gradual transition from being Jeremiah's granddaughters to becoming his wives in their early teens. "He told us it was God's plan," Mary testified. "He said our blood was special, chosen. When I had my first child and saw the baby's struggles, I asked if we had done something wrong. He said it was a test of our faith." Sarah's testimony revealed the depth of isolation the family experienced. "I was 21 before I learnt that most families didn't live like ours. I had never seen a television. I didn't know men had walked on the moon. The world grandfather created for us was all I knew." Defense attorney James Thornton, appointed by the court, faced the nearly impossible task of mounting a defense for Jeremiah. With the overwhelming physical and testimonial evidence, Thornton focused on questions of mental competency, arguing that decades of isolation had distorted Jeremiah's understanding of societal norms and legal boundaries. "My client built a world based on misguided but sincere beliefs," Thornton argued. His actions, while reprehensible by our standards, were consistent with the alternate reality he had constructed. This raises significant questions about his ability to distinguish right from wrong in conventional sense. The prosecution countered this argument with evidence from Jeremiah's journals, which showed a calculated awareness of outside social norms. Entries documented his instructions to family members about how to behave during their rare interactions with outsiders, specifically to avoid raising suspicions about their living arrangements. This demonstrated not delusion, the prosecution argued, but deliberate deception, evidence that Jeremiah understood societal taboos and worked actively to hide his violations of them. As the trial progressed, medical experts provided increasingly detailed testimony about the conditions affecting the Blackwood children. Dr. Catherine Williams, a pediatric specialist, presented heartbreaking details about the youngest generation. The 7-year-old daughter exhibits developmental delays consistent with an 18-month-old. She cannot speak in sentences and likely never will. The 5-year-old son has a severe heart defect requiring multiple surgeries. The 3-year-old twins both show early signs of progressive neurological disorders. These conditions represent a concentration of rare recessive genetic disorders that would be statistically impossible without consanguinity across multiple generations. On February 28th, in a surprise development, Jeremiah Blackwood requested to address the court. Judge Harrison, after consultation with both attorneys, allowed this unusual mid-trial statement. What followed was a disturbing 40-minute monologue that provided a window into the worldview that had shaped the Blackwood compound for decades. Jeremiah, then 70 years old, but appearing much older, spoke with surprising clarity about his beliefs. He traced his philosophy to his own grandfather, who had told him stories about the old families of Europe who maintained bloodlines through intermarriage. He described his conviction that modern society was degenerating through mixed blood, and positioned his family as preservers of a pure lineage that would eventually prove superior. When asked about the obvious suffering of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Jeremiah displayed a disturbing lack of remorse, stating that weakness must be burned away through generations of purification. He compared the process to metallurgy, where impurities are removed through repeated heating. This testimony, far from supporting the defense's strategy of claiming mental incompetence, instead revealed a coherent, if horrifying, worldview that had been methodically implemented over decades. Jeremiah's statement effectively undermined his own defense by demonstrating his awareness of conventional norms and his deliberate rejection of them in favor of his own system. The trial concluded on March 7, 1968, with closing arguments that reflected the broader societal questions raised by the case. Prosecutor Williams framed the proceedings as not just about one family, but about the tension between individual freedom and societal responsibility. In America, we value independence and the right to live according to one's beliefs. But that freedom cannot extend to the deliberate harm of others, especially children. The state has not only the right, but the obligation to intervene when isolation becomes a weapon and family becomes a prison defense attorney. Thornton made a final appeal based on cultural relativism, arguing that the Blackwoods represented an extreme version of the self-sufficient, independent lifestyle that has characterized the Ozarks for generations. This argument found little sympathy with either the judge or the jury. After just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts. 2 weeks later, on March 22nd, Judge Harrison delivered his sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty available under Missouri law at that time. In his sentencing statement, Judge Harrison addressed Jeremiah directly. "You have caused incalculable suffering, not from momentary passion or weakness, but from sustained, deliberate cruelty disguised as principle. Your victims include not only those directly harmed, but generations yet unborn who will carry the consequences of your actions in their very bodies." The conclusion of the trial marked the beginning of a new chapter for the surviving Blackwoods. With Jeremiah removed from their lives, they faced the daunting challenge of integrating into a society that was as foreign to them as another country. In the decades following Jeremiah Blackwood's imprisonment, the ripple effects of his actions continued to spread through both his family and the broader society. The Blackwood case eventually influenced medical research, social service protocols, and even legislation designed to better protect isolated communities. Jeremiah himself remained unrepentant until his death in Port-O-C Correctional Center in 1983. Prison records indicate he refused all visitors except his court-appointed attorney and spent his time writing extensive manifestos expanding on his disturbing theories of bloodlines and purification. These writings, examined by psychologists, revealed not mental illness in the clinical sense, but rather what Dr. James Peterson of the University of Missouri called a closed system of logic built on fundamentally flawed premises and immune to contradictory evidence. For Mary and Sarah, the transition to normal life presented enormous challenges. After 2 years in a specialized residential treatment program, they moved to a small community in northern Arkansas, where their connection to the notorious Blackwood case was unknown. There, with ongoing support from social services, they began the process of building independent lives. Sarah, who showed remarkable resilience, eventually earned a GED and became an advocate for victims of isolation and manipulation. In a rare public statement given at a conference in 1985, she reflected on her journey. "I lost 30 years of my life to one man's obsession. My children lost even more. But I refused to let his shadow darken the rest of my days or theirs." Mary's path proved more difficult. The psychological trauma she experienced left deeper scars, and she struggled with depression and anxiety throughout her life. She found some peace in art therapy, producing haunting paintings that were eventually displayed in a private exhibition titled "Emerging from Darkness" in Kansas City in 1990. She passed away in 1997 from complications related to early onset dementia, a condition her doctors suggested might have been linked to the stress she endured during her formative years. The children born of the consanguineous relationships faced the most severe consequences. The 7 youngest children, Jeremiah's offspring with Mary, and some required specialized care throughout their lives. Despite the dedicated efforts of medical professionals and caregivers, 5 died before reaching the age of 30 due to their genetic conditions. The 2 survivors continue to live in specialized care facilities in Missouri, their identities protected by court order. The older generation of Blackwoods, Jeremiah's sons and their families, faced difficult choices about whether to maintain any connection to their family identity. Most chose to change their surnames and relocate to different states, seeking anonymity and a chance to rebuild their lives away from the shadow of their infamous patriarch. Elijah Blackwood, Jeremiah's oldest remaining son, made a different choice. After serving 2 years in prison for his role in enabling the family's isolation, he returned to the Ozarks and became an unexpected ally in efforts to identify and help other isolated families. Working with social services, he provided valuable insights into the mindset of extreme isolation and helped authorities develop more effective intervention strategies. There are still places in these hills where families live cut off from the modern world, he explained in a 1975 interview. Not all are like ours was, but the potential for harm exists whenever people are completely disconnected from society's standards and protections. The broader impact of the Blackwood case extended far beyond one family. In medical circles, the detailed genetic studies conducted on the family provided valuable data on rare recessive disorders and the effects of consanguinity. Several medical textbooks published in the 1970s and 1980s included anonymized case studies based on the Blackwood children, contributing to improved understanding of genetic counseling. Social service agencies across the country developed new protocols for identifying and intervening in cases of extreme isolation. The Blackwood Indicators, a checklist of warning signs for potentially dangerous family isolation, became a standard training tool for rural social workers. These indicators included excessive secrecy about family relationships, withdrawal of children from school, visible genetic abnormalities across multiple family members, and unusual reactions to routine questions about family structure. In 1972, the Missouri legislature passed what became informally known as the Blackwood Law, which clarified the authority of state agencies to intervene in cases of suspected abuse or neglect, even in remote areas traditionally resistant to government involvement. Similar legislation followed in Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee states with their own isolated mountain communities. The Blackwood compound itself was eventually reclaimed by nature. After being held as evidence for several years, the property was sold at auction in 1974, but the new owners, perhaps deterred by its dark history, never developed it. A fire in 1979, likely caused by lightning, destroyed most of the remaining structures. Today, only stone foundations remain, gradually disappearing beneath the forest floor as the Ozark wilderness reclaims the site. The story of the Blackwoods serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of complete isolation from society and the devastating consequences of inbreeding across generations. It also highlights the delicate balance between respecting privacy and ensuring protection for vulnerable individuals, a balance that communities and authorities continue to negotiate in America's most isolated regions. Perhaps the most meaningful legacy comes from the resilience shown by the survivors. Despite unimaginable trauma and challenges, many found ways to build meaningful lives and even to use their experiences to help others. Their story is not just one of darkness, but also of the human capacity to emerge from shadow into light. As we conclude this examination of one of America's most disturbing family histories, we're left with both caution and hope. Caution about the dangers of isolation taken to extremes, and hope in the remarkable resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of profound trauma. If you've watched until here, it's because you appreciate these important historical accounts. Leave a comment saying I watched until the end, so I can get to know you and understand who truly values the stories on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe to uncover more hidden histories like this video, and share it with someone who appreciates learning about the darker chapters of our past that shaped modern understanding of genetics and family structures. The hills of the Ozarks hold many secrets, some still waiting to be told. But in sharing the Blackwood story, we ensure that the suffering of these forgotten victims serves a greater purpose as educating future generations about the importance of community connection, genetic diversity, and the protection of those most vulnerable among us.